I'd like to start with something that you talk about a lot, which is being authentic and creating an authentic life. What do you mean by that, and why is that so important, being authentic?
Well, authentic means that one has somehow a contact with a deep source within each of us. There's something that is inherently true for us. You can call it your instinctual truth or your inborn truth or even the soul, if you will, which is the literal word for the Greek word psyche. Mm-hmm. What does your soul tell you? What is the psyche trying to tell you? And how do I separate that from all the messages that are coming to me from the culture, again, family of origin, even from my own history? And sort of sort through there and say, all right, which of the messages that I'm in service to or perhaps succumbing to are more appropriate or more consistent with my own inner life and my own nature.
Now, the soul's purpose, I always wonder, how do you know what your soul's purpose is?
Well, I guess the good news is when we get off track, our psyche protests, and we call those protests symptoms. Sometimes they turn up in our relationships, sometimes they show up in our body, sometimes they show up in emotional storms that we have, such as depression, for example, or anxiety disorders, and sometimes they come to us in troubling dreams. And the psyche is always speaking, it's always expressing its point of view, and our task as individuals, and certainly my task as an analyst, is to try to say, well, how do I read the symptomatic response here, and how do I see what it is that is the corrective or the other value that perhaps has been neglected in my life and sort of bring that into greater play in my choices?
Now, if you're a believer, you're always thinking, well, I wonder what God's will is for me, what's God's will for me, and how do you know what God's will is for me or for you?
That's a question that I consider every day because I think, again, we are subject to so much traffic within. How do we know and how do we sort through? And I think I would turn to the word discernment. It's a discernment process over time. Mm-hmm. I often add to the sentence, you know, what is your God's will for you, or what is the will of the soul? Really, because you have to ask the question really. You can't necessarily trust the first responses because they're the conditioned responses, the archaic mm-hmm. messages and so forth. Over time, there's a discernment process that this feels right for me. It's confirmed by my experience. When I invest myself in these directions, there's a sense of reciprocity that comes back to it. Not just a paycheck or the approval of someone else, but you feel an inner sense of purposefulness and meaning. And when that's not the case, you know, we suffer, and the symptoms come to the surface.
It sounds like you have to be in alignment.
In alignment,
with whatever your will is.
Or in the Eastern tradition, getting right with the Tao, as it were.
They're getting right with the Tao, like that. Individuation, that's something that you bring in many of your books. Why is that important? What does it mean?
Individuation is so misunderstood as sort of self-absorption or narcissism. In fact, it's actually a form of submission, the submission of the ego's natural desire for comfort and for consensual approval and for predictability in service to whatever it is that wants to come into the world through us. Individuation is about becoming a person, sort of what the gods intended or what the soul intends, and that has very little to do with what perhaps my ego preferences might be or my comfort zone.